Hello there, and welcome to this installment of the Living Vogue Academy. In this video, we will be reviewing the standard and as-is contract for residential sale and purchase. While watching this training, I would encourage you to have a printed version of both forms handy so you can take notes. These files can be found in SkySlope, TransactionDesk, dotloop, or whatever transaction management software that you use. It's important to note that you must always use the most recent versions of any contracts. As of this recording, we're working on the contracts dated October 2021. The first thing I want to do before we dive into the training is make an important distinction, and then we'll be working solely off the standard contract. Both of these forms are identical with the exception of the language regarding inspections and right to cancel. If you look at your as-is contract, page 5, item 12, starting on line 260, you'll see the property inspection right to cancel paragraph. This is where the two vary. When we review the standard contract, you'll see that there is language built in that requires the seller to repair items that are not working in the manner that they're designed to. In the as-is, it's written as if you were buying the property literally as it is in the condition it is in. However, it's not entirely true. The as-is contract does not require the seller to repair anything. Of course, once you have the inspection done, you are free to ask for any repairs your client wishes. We do recommend guiding your client on what items to ask for, but that's another training in itself. Back to the contract. What this paragraph in the as-is contract allows your client to do is cancel the contract for any reason whatsoever within the inspection period. Literally, any reason, or for no reason at all. On the other side, it allows your buyer and the seller to negotiate repairs and either continue with the sale, or if an agreement can't be reached, the buyer may terminate the contract and receive their full deposit back, so long as you have not allowed the inspection period to expire. Once the inspection period has passed, the seller doesn't need to negotiate any repairs, and it's assumed your buyer's taking it as is. If the buyer cancels after the inspection period has expired, they risk losing their earnest deposit. So if you're still negotiating or even waiting on the inspection report to come back and the expiration date is nearing, it's recommended you ask for an extension via the extension addendum to contract form. You'll notice on this form you can extend any important dates that include the inspection, closing date, financing period, and others. As a side note, you'll see due diligence on this form. This is similar to an inspection period, however, it's specific for vacant land and commercial deals. Okay, so back to the as-is contract. The inspection period language is the sole difference between the two contracts. One, the as-is allows you to cancel for any reason the buyer wishes, whereas the standard, which we'll get into, does not, and we'll talk about the difference in more detail. So let's now switch over to the standard contract and start from the top. At the top of the residential contract for sale and purchase, you will notice blank spaces for the buyer and seller as well as the property description. Those will be automatically populated once you go through the wizard, depending on which transaction management software that you're using. If it does not, you can easily look this up through the property tax records. When we move on down to personal property line 21, it is important that you go ahead and put in washer and dryer if there is a washer and dryer in the house. The reason for this is it is not technically included as personal property. It is normally assumed that the washer and dryer are included. However, if it is not in the contract, the seller could take it and the buyer would have no recourse. So I recommend that you put it there. What I don't recommend you put there is any furniture other than the washer and dryer. The reason for this, if this is a finance deal, the lender does not want to see any furniture whatsoever other than that washer and dryer. They're okay with that. You put anything else on there, they're not financing it, and it will be kicked back to you. So it's always best to have any furniture, whether it's the entire house is being furnished or it's just specific pieces, that it be put on a separate bill of sale that is just for the buyer and seller and that the lender does not see. On line 24, if there are any items that are not included, let's just say there is a really nice chandelier that the seller wants to keep, that's where this would go so that it is noted that it is not included in the sale. When we move down to purchase price and closing, a lot of this is pretty self-evident. The purchase price is whatever you and your buyer have agreed to offer. That can always change based on if the seller comes back and counters. The initial deposit, line 28. This is the amount that is going to be held in escrow. It does go towards the purchase price. This is not the deposit or the percentage that they are paying in full. So if they're getting a 80-20 loan, this is not 20% of that purchase price. This is just what the buyer wants to show good faith to the seller, and it can be anywhere between 3 to 5% of the purchase price. That is traditional. When we move down to the escrow agent's information, so you have the option, and you'll see later on in this contract, either the buyer chooses the escrow agent or the seller chooses the escrow agent. And all this is who is handling the closing. My preference is that I always choose it because I have specific title and escrow agents that I like, I've used, and I trust. So I always encourage my client to allow us to choose. Now, it does mean that they're paying a little bit more in closing costs, but to make sure that the deal goes through without any hiccups, I believe it's worth it. But otherwise, if you're going to leave it for the seller to choose, you can write TBD, so that's to be determined, in the escrow agent name, unless it is marked in MLS. And sometimes at the very bottom of the MLS listing, you'll see that the seller does want to choose a specific escrow agent, and you can just go ahead and insert that information. Side note, you do not need to put a fax number in there. Rarely are faxes ever used. Everything is just sent electronically, so don't worry about getting that. Line 36, additional deposit to be delivered. This is optional. You do not have to put something in here. In fact, it's usually not used. The reason that it could be used is, let's just say your buyer wanted to put 10% down as an escrow deposit, but they wanted to do 5% up front and then 5% after the inspection. This is where you would put that additional 5%. Line 39 is where you're going to put in the financing. Again, make sure that you look at the pre-approval letter. It will have the percentage financed. And in this line, you're either going to put a percentage. So if it's an 80% loan, you'll put 80 with the percent sign, or you'll put the exact dollar amount. So much easier just to put the percentage. So that's what we typically recommend. Line 40 for other, again, very rarely used. If there's some other circumstances and some additional funding is being provided, you would write it in there. Time for acceptance. That's line 45. So this is you're sending off the contract for the seller to accept, and you're giving them X amount of days to accept it. If you want to be aggressive, you do it within 24 hours. If you want to give them a little bit time, 48 hours is what's normal. If there's a lot of holidays that are involved, maybe you need to extend it another day or so. But don't go too far out, because ultimately, if you're out 3, 4, 5 days, you're giving them that much more time to get other offers in. So 24 to 48 hours is what's typical. Now we move on to the closing date. Closing date depends on a lot of factors. What I highly recommend that you do is, of course, ask the buyer when they would like to close. Ask the seller if there are any specific dates they need to close by. And then, based on that information, talk to the title agent and the lender. All right, both of those people are important parts of this process, and they can hold things up. So even if your client and the seller want to close in 10 days and the lender says, hey, I need 20, there's not much you can do. So make sure you're talking to everyone prior to actually putting this closing date on there. And if for any reason you can't get a hold of them, just estimate it. Typically for cash deals, 30 days is more than enough. With finance deals, 45 days is a good rule of thumb. All right, so let's move down. A lot of the stuff in here is boilerplate stuff. I am not going through every single item on this contract. I highly recommend that you read through it, understand it. If you don't, ask your broker. All right, line 73, check if property is subject to lease or occupancy after closing. So if the seller is going to stay in the house for a certain amount of time after closing, this is where you would check that box, and there is an addendum that goes along with it. When we come down to item number 7, assignability, you have 3 options here. One is that the buyer may assign and thereby be released from any further liability under the contract. Then there's may assign but not be released from liability, and then may not assign this contract. The reason someone may want to check the first box is if they are a wholesaler, which means they are buying the property, they're getting it under contract, and they're holding it, right? So, and what they're trying to do is then sell this contract. So within the time frame allotted, whatever's in there with the time for acceptance, any of the contingencies, they are trying to find somebody that buy this for a little bit more than what they have it under contract for, and then they can sell it and be released. Most likely you're probably never going to use that. What I recommend is the second box, which is may assign but not be released from liability under this contract. What that means is, let's just say you put it under the specific names of your clients, and during the process they decide that they want to put it under an LLC. This allows them to do that, and there's no issue whatsoever. It's a simple addendum, and you can get the name changed. Of course, it doesn't release them from liability. And then the last one, may not assign, just means whoever's on the contract are the buyers, and there can be no changes. Let's go down to financing now, number 8. Very simple, 2 options. 1, it's a cash transaction. There's no financing contingency, which means there's no appraisal contingency as well. Or B, the contract is contingent upon a loan. Now, you do have blanks on here that you can fill out. If you leave them blank, you can see exactly how many days are included on that blank. You can modify that as need be. Again, if you talk to the lender and they think they can get it approved within 15 days, well, maybe you change the first blank to 20 versus 30. Or you can just leave it as is. The shorter you can make any of these contingencies, the more attractive your offer is going to be. Just make sure that you are comfortable with those time frames. Next, you have the option of conventional, FHA, VA, or any other type of loan. If it is FHA or VA, there is an addendum that goes along with that. Conventional, all you have to do is show a pre-approval. Then you have the option for fixed or adjustable. And then also you have the option of putting an interest rate in there. Now here is why you might want to be very specific here. Is let's just say interest rates are going up, and they're going up at a pretty quick rate. You might want to go ahead and put in whatever percentage rate your client has been approved for, and that if it goes above that, you can cancel this contract and get the earnest deposit back 100% because it exceeded the interest rate that you have on the contract. All right, same thing with the fixed or adjustable. If you choose a fix and they cannot qualify for a fixed loan, this contract can be canceled and the deposit returned. All right, if you leave it just open, then you leave your client open to having to move forward with whatever type of loan they can achieve. Now, 98, buyer shall make application for financing within. Typically leave that blank. Most likely, if you've done your part, they have actually already started that process. So you could just put a 0 there, and that will let the buyer or the sellers know that they have already begun the financing process. All right, we're going to scroll down lines 133 and 134. Really not something you're going to use. 133 just means that the buyer is going to assume the existing mortgage. They have to go through the whole lending process with the seller's lender, so nothing really changes there. They can assume it. And then the purchase money note just means that the seller is going to hold the note to the house. So they are it's seller financing. Again, 2 things that you really don't ever use. All right, now we get into closing costs for the buyer and seller. So first is on the seller side. Now this is where it gets a little interesting, and where the difference is between the as-is and the standard contract when it comes to inspections. We'll get into a little bit more detail, but let's just talk about some of the costs first. If you look at line 144, you have blank spaces to put either a percentage or a dollar amount for general repairs, wood destroying organisms, that's the WDO, or any costs associated with closing out open or expired building permits. So let's talk about the first one. Typically, yes, 1.5% is the standard, and that's what we go with, but it all depends on the value of the property, so you'll need to judge that, not only on the value of the property, but also just a quick estimate of how many things you think may go wrong or may need to be repaired. So if you know up front that let's say the refrigerator is not working, and you know that needs to be replaced, well, figure out what that's going to cost so that you're going to require the seller to repair or replace those items during the inspection. All right, so if you have the 1.5% on there with wood-destroying organisms, keep in mind wood-destroying organisms are for only things that destroy wood. So we're talking termites, any kind of bacterial growth, and we are not talking about rodents. All right, unless the rodents are chewing up the wood and it's constant, it's not included. So make sure you understand that. Of course, you can always ask for it. And if the seller or the listing agent don't understand what wood-destroying organisms are, and you complain about rats in the attic, well, they may be able to pay to have that taken care of. And then any costs associated with closing out open or expired building permits. Again, typically it's not something that you run into, but you absolutely could if they had something done, let's say windows installed, and for whatever reason the window company just didn't close out the permits. There is a cost involved in getting those permits closed out, so this just helps protect you. Again, 1.5% on all three of these is what's standard, but again, depends on the specific property and anything that you've noted while you've done your walkthrough or while you've done an inspection. All right, costs to be paid by buyer. Line 171. If you are representing the buyer and there is a transaction fee, this is where you'll want to put it. For us specifically, you would write in there $295 transaction fee to Living Vogue LLC. Again, that $295 is as the time of the recording. Sometimes that changes, so if it's changed, you'll put whatever the current amount is. Title evidence and insurance, 172. Again, typically just leave that one as is, no need to change it. Let's go down to 185 to 189. So this is about the closing agent, escrow agent, title agent, all the same thing that I mentioned earlier. So you either have the option of the seller shall designate the closing agent and pay for the owner's policy and charges, or the buyer shall designate closing agent and pay for owner's policy and charges. So again, whoever chooses the title company will pay a little bit more in closing costs, but again, on my end, I recommend it just because I can use somebody that I know and trust. Obviously, 191, Miami-Dade Broward Regional Provisions, not apply to us, so we can move on. Then we look at line 201, 202, home warranty. Depends on the market that we're in. In a seller's market, you're typically not going to get a home warranty. In a buyer's market, sometimes you can ask the seller to pay for a home warranty, and that's where you would put this information. If you are purchasing a home warranty for your client as, let's say, a gift, you don't need to put this here. That's just something between you and your buyer. Now let's move down to special assessments. So line 211 and 213. Special assessments are simply assessments that a homeowners association has assessed on a specific property. So let's just say it's a condo and they had the roof replaced, and it was $20,000 roof. There's 2 units per building, and they're splitting that $10,000 between both owners, and it's going to be paid over 10 years. So that's $10,000 per unit owner, $1,000 per year. Let's say 5 years go by. Well, the current seller has already paid $5,000 and $5,000 is still owed. So now you have options here. You can either say, hey, look, the seller's just going to pay the installments due prior to closing, and the buyer will pay the remaining once those are due. Or you can ask the seller to go ahead and pay that assessment in full prior to closing. So they would pay the additional $5,000 before the closing takes place, and now your buyer does not have to worry about that assessment. Let's move on. It goes through a lot of the disclosures. Okay, now we get into the specific information on the inspection, and also what your client's rights are. Because as in the as is, like I stated earlier, your buyers can cancel really for any reason or no reason whatsoever as long as they stay within the inspection period. So on the as-is contract, you do have an area where you can write in the inspection period. So whether that's a 5-day inspection period, 10 or 15, which is the general rule of thumb, that's how long your client has to cancel the agreement. With this standard contract, it's not the same. So you do write in the inspection period. And what you'll have here is you have options. Once you go through the inspection, let's just say that the refrigerator's not working properly, the dishwasher's not working at all. All right, for that first item, the general inspection, the only items that are included and that the seller have to repair are any general repair items that are not working in the manner in which they were designed to. So again, if the refrigerator's not working properly, they are going to be required up to the general repair limit. So if you put 1.5% in there, then 1.5% of the purchase price does go towards those general repair items. If the dishwasher is not working and it is not repairable, they have to replace it. Again, up to the general repair limit. So what happens if those two items, let's just say in the general repair limit, it's a maximum of $10,000 that the seller has to come out of pocket to repair or replace. And let's say those two items together are going to be $12,000. You have a couple options there. One is the seller can say, hey, I'm going to go ahead and just give you a credit for the $10,000 and then you take care of the rest. Or they can say, I'll fix XYZ items and you take care of the rest up to the $10,000 limit, and the buyer has to take care of the rest. As long as the buyer agrees to that, they can go on and the contract remains in full force. If the seller says, hey, I'm going to go ahead and take care of everything, so I'm going to take care of the $12,000 even though it's over the $10,000 limit, the buyer is required to continue with the contract. If the seller says, hey, I'm only going to do the $10,000 and the buyer has to do the rest of it, and the buyer doesn't like that, then the buyer can cancel the contract. So this is where the buyer does have an out. If the general repair items exceed that general repair limit that you have put into this contract, the buyer can cancel if the seller decides not to fix everything. Okay, so let me say that again. If the general repair limit that is written in this contract is, for example, $10,000, so the seller has to repair any items that are not working in the condition they were meant to up to $10,000. They don't necessarily have to go above and beyond that. But if they don't, and the buyer does not want to fix the remaining items, the buyer can send written notice to the seller saying, hey, there's too many things wrong with this house. I know you'll pay the $10,000, but I am not willing to pay that extra $2,000. I'm canceling this contract. And you can, and they will get their deposit back. Now, the seller could technically come back and say, okay, well, look, I'll go ahead and take care of the rest if you'll continue with this contract. And as long as both parties are happy with that, they can. So I highly recommend that you read this paragraph in detail and really understand it, because some of the things in here are very specific as to what is included in the general repair items and what is not. And one thing that I want to point out on line 299 is that torn screens, including pool and patio screens, fogged windows, and missing roof tiles or shingles shall be repaired or replaced by seller prior to closing. That is huge. If you know what fogged windows means, when you have double pane windows and there's fog in between that you cannot clean or rub off, that means there is a break in the seal, and that can cost a lot of money to repair. Well, in the standard contract, that is an item that is required to be repaired. Same thing with screens that are broken out on the lanai, which is a common issue. Same thing with those windows. It's common to see the fogged windows. And then again, it specifically defines what cosmetic conditions are. So cracks in tiles are not included. And then it defines what working condition, and it means operating in the manner in which the item was designed to operate. If it's not, that is an item that can be covered under the general repair items. So read through all that, understand it. Wood destroying organisms, again, it's the same thing as far as the amounts and how your client can cancel the agreement or negotiate with the seller. But just keep in mind, the WDOs is for anything that destroys wood, not for rodents. Now, again, as a side note, if the seller and the listing agent don't know that, you absolutely can bring up, hey, there are rats in the attic. Under the WDO inspection, we want to have that taken care of. If they don't know what WDO stands for, that's their fault, not yours. So get as much as you can out of them as possible. And then same thing with the inspection closeout building permits. I do highly recommend that you reach out to the title company as quickly as possible for them to do this search. You can also do a search yourself online, just going to the tax office and seeing if there were any permits that were pulled for the property and making sure that they were all closed out. All right, again, keep going through a lot of boilerplate stuff here. Talks about buyer and seller default, any dispute resolutions, title exams, surveys. If you're ever representing a seller and they have the survey, I highly recommend that you keep that handy. It's just going to save the buyer some money, and it's just a nice thing to do. But also ask the listing agent if the seller does have a current survey. All right, so you scrolled all the way down to number 19, the addenda. Always look at the MLS listing. If the listing agent has done their job properly, all the addenda will be listed on the MLS listing. If not, you may have to ask for it. But if there's a homeowners association, if there's a condo rider, if the house was built before 1978, you need the lead-based paint disclosure. Any other disclosures that are going to be included in the contract need to be checked here. And if there's not one that's listed here, maybe a CDD, so the Community Development District, as in Lakewood Ranch properties typically, it's not listed as one of the line items here, but you can always include it as one of the other addenda on this form. And then if you need to write in any additional terms, if you're trying to be, let's say you're really trying to be aggressive with an offer because there's several other offers on the table, and you want to say something to the effect of, let's say it's being financed, and you want to put in there that, hey, even if the appraisal comes in less than the agreed upon price, the buyer will continue with this contract and will pay cash for the difference from what they don't get from lending. That is something that you can put in this additional terms section. So anything you want to add will be here. But again, you do not want to put any furniture on this form. Any furniture should be a completely separate addendum, or I'm sorry, a separate bill of sale that is between the buyer and seller. If you do put it on an addendum, well, sometimes the lender will find out that, hey, you've got 3 addendum noted here, but I only have 2. Where's the third one? And the third one was the furniture. So then you get caught and there's just an issue. You get the job done, but it's just several steps that you have to go through to remove the furniture, make the underwriter happy, and it's just a pain you don't want to have to go through. If we scroll down all the way to the bottom, again, if you fill this out using one of the wizards, the buyer and seller's names will be at the bottom there. You do not need to fill out lines 711 to 713. If you have it, great. If not, do not worry about it. Again, everything is e-filed, so typically there's nothing being mailed anymore. And then at the bottom, your name as well as the brokerage and the listing agents and their brokerage should be on there as well. So there you have it, the standard and the as-is contract. Keep in mind the differences between the inspection and the right to cancel, and really read those 2 sections to understand them. So with that, if you have any questions, reach out to any one of the brokers that we have here at Living Vogue. We're happy to answer any questions or go over the contract with you. So until next time, I hope you decide to be a professional in this industry. Because while real estate isn't perfect, it is better. Until next time, take care.